So, Chris, it's great to have you here today as we talk a little bit about the state of manufacturing. I know we got together here a couple weeks ago at the MT Forecast event, so welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and for those that have not met you before, this is the Chris Chidzik, and he is a professional with the Association for Manufacturing Technology, or AMT. For those that aren't familiar with that, you might be familiar with the IMTS show that's put on in Chicago every year for the manufacturing community, and AMT is the association that puts that on. And so Chris comes to us with a wealth of insights on current trends, economic forecasting, and the horizon for manufacturing. So I'm looking forward to diving into it with you, Chris, here about what's going on in the manufacturing community.
Yeah, super excited to be here. Ask away.
Perfect. Let's get into it. So first off, why don't you just set the stage, right? So we want to talk a little bit about, from a broad sense, what's the latest state of manufacturing with the data that you have, and kind of catch people up, the data that you're pulling from, what's going on in the markets, in the community, and manufacturing in general.
Absolutely. So what we do at AMT is we actually have a statistical program called USMTO, US Manufacturing Technology Orders. And what that does is it tracks orders of manufacturing technology, including metal cutting machines, metal forming machines, and a whole list of other equipment that our members make or sell. That has monthly data that's available to the public, but participants can also access much more granular information. So
having been a participant, I don't think people fully appreciate what this means. And so in layman's terms, you can literally look at the country and look by county, or, on how many machine tools were sold into that county of basically any type of machine tool.
Yep, exactly. And see, where your sales stack against your competition, if there were any sales that, you might not have even known about.
But it's
really good information.
It's super deep, but it's also will tell you, like, if I'm selling to a specific type of manufacturers, and I know the types of machines those manufacturers use. I mean, I just think about it from a sales standpoint. I know the hot zones around the country of where the epicenters are for those types of machines, and so therefore I know the epicenters of where I might be wanting to focus my time.
Yeah, absolutely. So as an economist, I kind of use the high level data for a little bit of the nerdy stuff that we're going to talk about later. But on a practical level, it's a really, really invaluable sales tool.
Yeah. So, I don't think everybody fully understands that exists. And we talk about it in the industry all the time. But so giving people that lay of the land, I think, is helpful. But continue. So talk about the manufacturing state of the business, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that aside and endorsement. But so looking at the USMTO data, so far through August 2024, orders are down 11.5%. Now, it sounds bad, but I like to kind of take a little bit of a step out as well. So if we go back to 2020, 2021 during COVID, orders dropped dramatically and then rebounded within months. If you remember, all the consumers started shifting their demand from, restaurants and travel to things you can make at home or do at home, or RVs, things like that. So demand for manufactured goods really, really increased, and manufacturers had to respond by building additional capacity. And those extra demands really increased orders. They peaked in late 2021, and the market has been declining ever since then. But I don't really like to characterize it as much of a decline as more of a normalization, because demand was at such a crazy high level in 2021 and 2022 that even though 23 and 24 have seen declines, we're still above the average monthly order value for most months of the year.
So things are down. Speaking to that, because we had these conversations in MT Forecast a year ago, and the whole thing, and I've been telling this to the market and myself, is 2024 at the end of 2023. 2024 was supposed to be considered a rebuild year, and getting prepared for 25, 6, and 7, and as in the coming years. But to that comment is, yes, it feels like things are down, but they're really not down in the grand scheme of the horizon of things. And yes, I think most manufacturers could appreciate flat or down for the year.
Absolutely, absolutely. And although the beginning through the first 8 months of the year, like I said, we're down 11.5%, I think the last third of the year is really going to pick up a little bit. If you go back to everything that was spoken about at MT Forecast, between the Oxford forecast, the Gardner Capital Spending Survey, all of those are generally saying orders are going to end up down about 5 to 7% by the end of the year. So that means that there's going to be a pretty decent uptick between September, October, November, and December. And it just so happens, we had one of those IMTS years this year, and based on the sentiment, we don't have the data yet, but based on the sentiment, it does look like it might be that turning point in the market.
And so speak to that, like, is there regional focuses, right? Because IMTS is a huge international conference, and yet inside the United States, there's these hot zone epicenters for manufacturing, right? The Southwest is a really big hot zone. Around Lake Michigan is a big hot zone. But even here in Minneapolis, where we're at, we have this nice hot zone around the Twin Cities metro area of certain types of manufacturing. So are there regional outcomes that people should be aware of as well inside the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned a little bit earlier about, as a participant in USMTO, how granular you can get with the data. In our monthly press release, we actually break down the national numbers into 6 different regions. The Midwest is typically one of the strongest ones. As everybody in the industry knows, there's a huge manufacturing base in and around the Midwest. So that typically tends to be one of the epicenters of manufacturing technology demand. Outside of that, like you mentioned, the Southeast has been really big recently, especially with the auto industry. And then the South Central region with oil and gas extraction, things like that. A lot of the regional trends tend to also be industry-specific trends. So generally knowing where things are concentrated and what industries are prevalent will kind of tell you how that region's doing. The Midwest is one of those weird ones, though, where you have a little bit of everything. So that one's kind of stands alone in its trends.
And so with that, as you start thinking about where the state of it is, so you're starting to see, based on the numbers and some of the early sentiment back, you're starting to see this, if we're at 11.5 now, maybe we're going to end at 7 or 6 or 8 or 5 or whatever the number is for the end of the year. There's a 3 to, let's say, 6% kind of bump that people might get at the end of the year. Can you talk more about what the sentiments are or the feelings are for this coming year, like 25, maybe 26, 7, but especially 25, because we're in that time of year where everybody's kind of getting ready to do their budgets or in the middle of that or trying to figure that out. So from that perspective, is there any, let's say, general thoughts of what we're looking at for 25?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 2 things I really want to highlight. First is the Oxford forecast, which we saw at MT Forecast, and we've seen kind of throughout the year in our quarterly economic update webinars. They've been projecting for quite a while that 25 is going to be up around 19 to 20%. Which,
can you pause?
In all honesty,
so for all of us that are hard of hearing, can you just say that number again, please?
Yeah, about 19 to 20%. And
19 to 20%?
Yep. Okay. In all honesty, I did roll my eyes the first time I saw it. But the more you kind of look at it, and if you look at the shape of the data over time, the upswings tend to move up really fast, and then the downturns tend to move a little bit slower. So if you look at, I think it's got a lot to do with how we collect the data. Remember, we collect orders, not shipments. So when manufacturing is doing well, capacity is tight, and people need additional machinery to meet their customers' demands, it tends to happen all at once. And especially if you look at the situation that happened coming out of COVID in late 2020 through 21, early 22, everybody was really demanding stuff all at the same time. That doesn't mean it was all shipped at the same time.
Sure.
So
yeah, backlog just grew, right? Backlog would
Yep.
grow. Order demand's higher, but backlog might grow as part of that, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. And then that really smoothed out the deliveries, and it looked like it made a little bit more sense. So I think that the number is actually pretty decent approximation of what might happen. The other thing I want to point to is the Gartner Capital Spending Survey. We work with our friends at Gartner Business Media to put that together every year. It's a survey of manufacturers basically saying, what's your capital equipment budget going to be next year? And looking at that for 2025, that one was up 19%. So I was a little shocked and how close it was to that Oxford forecast. And the more I'm reading, the more I'm understanding, I think it might be plausible.
Okay. But I mean, what we're talking about though is let's say directionally correct, right? So whether it's 19, 25, 16, it's not zero. It's not negative.
Yep.
It's not even 5 or 10. So it's double digits kind of growth, even if it's off a point or two. And I think that's important for people to understand. It's like, well, it's forecasting, so how accurate it is. But I think going back to ITR, Gardner, what you guys have done, the stats would actually say that those forecasts are relatively close. Like they're not off by 15%. They're off by like, maybe a couple percent points one way or the other. They're not off by 10 points, right? Like that is historically is what we've been talking about.
Yep, we haven't updated it in a while, but a couple MT forecasts ago, the former chairman of our Economics and Statistics Committee actually put up a slide saying, here's the past of what Oxford said, what Gardner said, and then what it ended up actually being according to USMTO. So that was actually a pretty good visualization of, although it's not exact in the number, the trends tend to move in the similar direction. Now, of course, that was before 2020 when things tended to be a little bit more predictable.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, and part of that too is we're in an election year, right? So there's commonality around what happens during prior to an election and post-election. Whether it's rational or not is really irrelevant, but it's consistent, right? Like we have these same kind of behaviors before and after election. My assumption, or what I've always understood, is pre-elections, market tends to kind of wait and see, so to speak, right? Whereas in post-election, okay, at least we know what we're dealing with now, so let's start moving, right? And so do you see some of that as part of this process too?
I think we are seeing that a little bit. A lot of people,
or is that a false assumption? Because I'm not assuming that that's the right assumption, right?
I'm gonna pull the Economist card and say yes to both. A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I think it does have somewhat of an effect, but I think it's a lot more on a kind of a vibe basis. People are just saying, I don't know what's going to happen. Let me wait. But also at the end of the day, it does kind of have a real component to it, because I think if people had orders in their hand and they needed additional machinery to make their customers happy and keep those contracts, they're going to make that investment at the end of the day. I wrote this article, when was this? Around 2022, right after the midterm elections. I kind of wanted to see, was there any effect on manufacturing technology orders? When it comes to who's president, the punchline is it really didn't matter. There was absolutely no correlation between what party was.
That's important.
In the White House.
I think everybody needs to take a moment and just absorb that for a second. But go ahead, keep going.
Absolutely, yeah. The one thing that was actually really interesting that did have somewhat of a significant impact was the size of the majority in Congress. It didn't matter which party held Congress, but the smaller the majority held by the majority party, that's a tongue twister there. Yeah. the smaller it was, the lower orders tended to be.
Or the
And
bigger the majority, the bigger the orders.
exactly. And I think that one really made me scratch my head for a little bit, because I was like, well, that's weird. But then I was thinking about it, and, I think the smaller majority, the fewer people can just totally derail whatever legislative priorities leadership has, and it really introduces like a bit of uncertainty, especially around budget negotiations, debt ceilings, all that kind of stuff. It just introduces a little more uncertainty that, for real reasons or not, does give people a little bit of pause when making large capital investments.
Yeah, the market loves certainty, right? The more certain, the more the market seems to perform, and so that's good. So let's put ourselves in the head of a president, let's say of a manufacturing company for a second. So two parts to this. First, let's talk about emotional readiness. Like, what do I mean, right? I'm looking at cash flow, I'm looking at revenue, I'm looking at costs, I'm looking at all this stuff. It's not been, let's say, the best like turn of events over the last, number of months. My stuff is down. I'm probably really cost conscious at the moment. Is there a bit of a play of how do I emotionally prep myself that even though these things are happening to me right now, today, in the moment, I'm taking the right moves mentally and, on the books, on paper, whatever it is, to actually prep. I'm not following the lemmings off the ledge, right? Like, I'm prepped to do what I need to do. Like, talk a little bit about the emotional readiness to take on this stuff for that group.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do have to preface, I tend to be ridiculously optimistic about everything.
Sure.
I always used to joke with people. I'm like, that might make me a bad economist, because the typical image in your head is everybody just crying recession every 2 days.
Okay, right.
But no, I was actually reading a paper by Alan Blinder the other day, and he the results were kind of 50-50, and he goes, but I tend to see the glass as half full. And I was like, all right, cool, it's not just me.
So with that being said, I mean, think about that president. Like, what do they do to, in spite of everything they might be seeing, to that point, get positive, get optimistic, and actually start making the moves? Because, if I'm already not making the moves right now, I'm probably behind the power curve in order to absorb the 20% going forward, right?
Yep, absolutely. And one of the biggest things that we have to look at is the demand for additional efficiencies. I think what happened in that really big order period of 21, 22, purchases were being made purely for capacity. And just speaking with a couple people, hearing it anecdotally at IMTS, a lot of people are looking for squeezing a little bit more efficiency out of their operations or improving quality. That was also kind of confirmed with the Gardner Capital Spending Survey. One of the questions they ask are, what's the main driver of your capital investment in 2025? And capacity needs drop down, and it's now improved quality or improved efficiency. So I think a lot of what you can be looking for in 2025, where that 20% potential growth is going to be coming from, is multifunction machines, machines with additional automation, anything that, in this environment with somewhat of a tight labor supply and kind of uncertainty almost, is how to be as efficient as possible.
But really, that's actually, if you think about it, it's being behind the power curve, because it's basically following the lemmings. I'm reacting to what I'm feeling versus looking out in the front of me and reacting to what's coming. And so that's probably the warning for many of the presidents, let's say, watching, is don't be the lemming, right? Like the reality is that if the forecasting is showing double digits, but you're going back and looking at performance efficiency, you're really missing the opportunity in terms of either market growth, share growth, revenue growth, whatever it is, because you're really not thinking about how would I go capture the 20, not just the 20% that is my fair share, but the other guy's 20%, because he's doing the exact same thing about trying to squeak 1 to 2% out of the operation side versus going and just grabbing the other 20% that's in the market, right?
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
So with that being said, okay, you think about that mental shift, and there's a whole host of conversation that can be had in terms of helping presidents shift their mindset from the 3-foot worldview to the 3-month, 6-month, 9-month worldview in front of them, which is its own topic. But what are some of the moves that they should be making right now tactically in their organizations to prepare for that next year 20%? Because we already talked about,
Mhm.
if they were already in the right mindset, they would have been spending the whole 2024 with the
Mhm.
mindset to prep for the double digit. Like we were talking about this last year, you need to use 2024 to prep for 2025's growth.
Mhm.
But even if I haven't done that and I'm behind that power curve, what kind of moves should I be looking at making right now to help prep for the Q1, Q2 of 25?
Absolutely. I think the number one move that needs to be made is with your workforce. Make sure you have the right people, enough people, and they're all trained. If you look at manufacturing employment, just in general, um, it's up a good bit. One of the statistics I love to point out is the COVID recession was the first recession since 1979 that manufacturing employment was higher after than before.
Oh, wow.
Now,
Didn't
it's
know that one.
only, yeah, absolutely. And monthly on average, it's about 100,000 jobs higher than the pre COVID peak. Um, Now, it's gone up and exceeded the pre recession peak, but it's really, really flattened out the last almost 2 years. So I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of availability of people to do the jobs that are needed, and further, the lack of people that are trained to do them. So although in the general labor market, things have gotten less tight, I think in manufacturing, the labor market is still very, very tight, especially looking at how it's flattened so dramatically
Oh man,
in the last.
you're speaking to the choir here, because we have, I mean, I've got business teams that are actually just trying to focus on how do we get the economy, the legislator, all those to focus more
Mhm,
on the manufacturing community. And just going back to Minneapolis here, manufacturing is our number one sector. It's
mhm,
way bigger than ever. There's 350,000 jobs in the state of Minnesota alone that are only manufacturing. It dwarfs all the other sectors. And so, but people forget that. It's like nobody wants to talk about it. It's that dirty building that's on the river. I want to get off the
mhm.
river kind of mindset versus
Yep.
this is actually the heart of your economic. I was just talking to a president before this call. What is the one key way you can bring money into a community? It's sell stuff that you made in the community
Mhm.
to another community. Like,
Yep,
and money comes
exactly.
in. So I think getting back to that mindset of that move of understanding the importance of developing that talent pool within not just your own organization, but within that community that you're in is such a missed opportunity, I think, in so many places.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it also has to do with, perception. When you think of manufacturing, you think, way back in the day, those old timey shops that aren't that nice. And to be honest, I've actually been in factories that are cleaner than my apartment.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's on me or on them, but somewhere in between.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking clean rooms, right? Like we're
Oh,
talking like,
just
hey, there's
shop
shop
floor.
floors, and
Yep.
I've been in a bunch of them too, where you've got scrubbers on the top of the machine, so there's
Hmm.
no smells, there's no oils and all that. The floors are cleaner than they are. They're swept every day. I mean, like, yeah, I
Yep.
know, completely get that there's a mystique around manufacturing that I'm basically working in a sweaty, hot, no air conditioning, bad environment that, I mean, it's just not always the case anymore. In fact, there's a lot of cases where it isn't.
Absolutely. And I think automation actually has a huge part in that. That's another thing that I feel like the perception is just totally off of. People think, the robots are coming for our jobs, but they're not. They're coming for the parts of your job that you don't want to do. And in a lot of cases, they free up your time to do something either in an air conditioned office or a better job that's higher paying.
So you talked about the labor piece, getting your talent in place to harvest the growth. Are there other key factors that really presidents should be thinking about right now?
I think the labor issue is the biggest one. The other one is tax implications. If anybody's thinking about making capital investment anytime soon, make sure to check out the bonus depreciation that's allowed for under the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. For the first 5 years, it was allowing 100% immediate expensing of all capital investment. That started to be phased down 20% per year until I think 2027 when it goes to nothing. So at the end of this year, if you're planning to make capital investments in the near future and you don't do it by December, you're going to lose potentially 20% of the amount that you can expense just by waiting until 2025.
Yeah, what a difference a day would make if you weren't getting it in at that last week of Christmas.
Yep, exactly.
So then let's ask a different question. Is there any others? Like, okay, so we talked about the tax, we talked about the labor. Is there any other key ones that we should be thinking about over these next 90 days as we get ready and prep for 25?
There's a couple other little things.
That's a lot in and of itself, but I mean, anything else that you
for sure. There's a bunch of little things that I think could compound to something, but I think honestly those are the two biggest things that should be focused on right now.
Okay, cool. And so with all this in mind, is there so looking at the historic data, right? Some of this is you can use case study examples of people that have been chasing the forecast, like, oh, I had a bad 24, therefore now all of a sudden I'm going to put my revenue target down for 25. I'm going to treat 25 as just an incremental better than 24. I'm going to set my plans for that, and I'm always chasing, right? Versus the ones that are like, yeah, I knew 25 was coming. I knew 24 was coming. 24 was a rebuild. I'm going to go take market share in 25. Like, do you, just to help context-wise, when you look at those two mindsets, is there a case study? Is there some sort of example? Do you see performance differences between those two mindsets? Like anything that you can speak to that can help a president understand they need to get to the proactive mindset versus the reactive mindset? Anything to help on that front?
Not that I can think of. I think just, talking to your customers is the number one thing you can do. See how they're feeling, because their outlook becomes your outlook. So have a good sense of what your customers are doing, what they're forecasting, what their customers are thinking, or what they're hearing from them, and really kind of not trickle down, but trickle up your planning, because pretty much, your customer's outlook is going to become yours.
And some of that might be training your customers, right? I mean, part of this is helping your customers not be reactionary as well. And there as a president, especially for your key accounts, is there ways for you to help give the key accounts that you have the same kind of information so they're more future oriented in their planning and shifting that kind of mindset. So that's helpful. I guess with that being said, any last advice, if you're going to talk to that president of a manufacturing company who's going through budgeting right now, is thinking about all of these things, their risk, maybe is in even that mode of exhaustion is the way I've been recently expressed it. It's like, it's just been a slog a bit this last, year, trying to work through the down, getting all these things shifted over. Is there any last advice you'd like to leave them with for as they start thinking about 25?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember who said it, but I heard this really great analogy at a conference the other day, or not the other day. This was a couple weeks ago. I say the other day, and it could be anywhere from yesterday to 5 years ago. Yeah. But so I heard this really good analogy about, each data point's a tile, and looking at one tile, you just see a tile, but you really have to put them all together and take a step back to see what the full mosaic is. And I really like that analogy because, you can't really be dependent on any one data set or data point. You kind of have to take everything together and see what the full picture is. And then not only that, reassess what you're looking at from time to time. And, you mentioned the MT Forecast event that we have once a year. That's a great event, but throughout the year, we also have quarterly webinars with updated forecasts, additional speakers, just hopefully providing you additional tiles so you can help build that mosaic of what the future might look like.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I mean, this is all about that, so I have a business group that's called Project High Tide, and the whole idea is that we can raise the tide of manufacturing community. So often I find that people look at, competitors in the wrong way. Like, there's a community of manufacturing companies, and if you actually look at about how we compete, the real question is, are we competing against somebody else in our geography, or are we competing against those outside of our geography? Are we, you know what I mean? Like, if you start to take that premise of, high tide raises all boats, you might have a different view on how do I be proactive, how do I get in front of it. So I love that mosaic kind of mindset, because it's that more of that broader mindset of, bringing more people in and raising the whole community in general. I think that's great. So from that, I appreciate, this has been an awesome conversation. And so if anybody has any questions on anything that we've talked about, obviously you can reach out to Chris, you can reach out to myself, the group at AMT, or the Next Step to learn more. I just leave it with this, this whole idea of forecasting and manufacturing isn't, people look at it like, oh, I can have this wand and I can go out there and predict the future, but it's really starting to get to be more of a proactive versus a reactive mindset. It starts to make the leaders more resilient and confident in the decisions that they're making. And as we can get the group out in the community to do more of that, we're going to make better decisions in our businesses and to help each other going forward. So it just, again, encourage anybody that's watching this to take that proactive stance, reach out with questions, and just know that there's a community around you that's trying to help you. So I know it can be lonely and exhausting at that president role, so please do that.